2 years ago. I first met Sarah 2 years ago at the 2018 Palm Cop conference, where she gave a terrific presentation on her work with Forrest Hall at Middle Tennessee State University in Murfreesboro. That's where she's the Political and Regional Collections Archivist at the Albert Gore Research Center. She's also the project archivist for the Black Craftspeople Digital Archive, the focus of our opening keynote by Dr. Tiffany Moman this morning, so it's a great bookend to our conference. Sarah's a native of Florida. She earned her BA in History from the University of Florida and her MA in Public History from Middle Tennessee State University in 2016. The Public History Department at Middle Tennessee State is one of the best in the Southeast and the nation. She studied archival management as well as civil rights and Black Power. She is an active member of Project STAND, Student Activism Now Documented, and is currently serving as president of the Society of Tennessee Archivists. Her current research interests focus on the intersection of digital archives, ethics, and social justice, and include 20th century student activism and social movements in the United States. Sarah also enjoys studying online communities and fandom, particularly how those spaces interact with sexuality and gender issues. And one of the things I'll say as an old dinosaur is that it's exciting to me to see people combine their research and profession with activism. I'm from that old school that believed, whether honestly or not, sincerely, I think most of the time, I'm from that old school that believed that it was possible to be objective. And we now know, of course, that it's impossible, and you need to fight against the idea that you can be objective. So activism, I think, is something that archivists and historians are working on all the time. But thank you for being with us, Sarah, and I'll turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you so much for that great introduction, Tracy. I'm going to share my screen now. There we go. I'm actually going to turn my video off too while I present, just to make sure we have no bad internet connections. All right. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for sticking around this long to listen to me speak. I really appreciate it. I know everyone's probably tired. I just ate some chocolate, so hopefully I have a sugar high through this. Very big thank you to the South Carolina Archival Association for inviting me to be one of this year's keynote speakers. It's really an honor, especially to be considered alongside Dr. Tiffany Moman, who I think is one of the most important public historians of our time right now. So thank you so much. Today I wanted to discuss building inclusive archival spaces and dismantling white supremacy in our profession, both of which are embedded in the archival activism tradition. I'll go over some of the foundations of archival activism since 1970, before getting into the contemporary scholarship about implementing social justice initiatives into our everyday practice. Then I'll get into some internal and external actions that you can take to transform your thinking and work. I'll specifically explain how this redemptive model of labor operates at my institution, the Albert Gore Research Center in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. But before I begin, I have to acknowledge some fellow archivists for their contributions to the field, especially those people whose ideas and words appear in this presentation. These people challenge us every day to be better archivists and, more importantly, better humans. There are, of course, some veterans of the archival field listed here, names you probably recognize like Terry Cook and Vern Harris and Randall C. Jimerson, who persistently discuss the relationship between archives, power, and social justice. Then the names you see in orange are contemporary thinkers and memory workers who have opened up my eyes and my mind to what the archives field could be if we are daring enough to do the work. So I want to give a shout out to Jarrett Drake, Samantha Wynn, Stacy Williams, Burgess Jules, Lael Hughes-Watkins, and Michelle Caswell specifically. I'm forever grateful for their leadership and their perspective. All right, let's get started. Since we're going to talk about the importance of self-reflection later, I figured it would be appropriate to begin with telling you a little bit about myself and where I come from. I was born into a working class family in southern Florida and raised in the fairly liberal college town Gainesville, which is also where I spent my undergraduate years, mostly studying the Black freedom struggle in the United States. I moved to Murfreesboro, Tennessee in 2014 to pursue my master's in public history. It was at MTSU that I began this journey of putting archival activism at the center of my work. I had been involved in activism before in high school and undergrad, but what I experienced during my time at MTSU shaped who I am today as both archivist and human. I was in the second year of my master's program when Black students started protests against the ROTC building on our campus, which is named after Nathan Bedford Forrest, who was a slave trader, a Confederate general, and an early leader of the Ku Klux Klan. During the 2015-2016 academic year, I straddled the line as both student activist and student archivist, as I participated in and documented the protest movement for the university archives. Since that experience, I have been educating myself on past and present issues and uses of social justice initiatives in the archives profession. Even more important, I have come to understand the archives field as deeply rooted in whiteness and oppression. Memory workers like Michelle Caswell have made it clear that in order to liberate archives from oppressive practices, we must first self-reflect to become acquainted with our identities and confront our own biases. As a working class, white, cisgender, queer, physically disabled woman, I am a mixture of both oppressive and privileged identities, along with marginalized ones. I bring all of these perspectives with me to work, and it is the constant effort of education and action to ensure that I am reducing harm and creating an equitable archival space. This redemptive and reparative work has a long history. Within the traditional archives field, and when I say traditional, I'm typically referring to those professionalized spaces filled with white people who got advanced degrees and certifications in archival science. Within that space, archival activism has some of its earliest foundations in 1970 at the annual meeting for the Society of American Archivists, excuse me. It was there that Howard Zinn gave a speech on the necessary rebellion of the archivist. He addressed a space filled with archivists and told them that their much believed neutrality was fake, and that archives are biased towards the important and powerful people of society. They are biased toward the rich, not the poor, toward men, not women, toward white people, not Black people, toward those who are free rather than those who are incarcerated. Essentially, archives often ignore those who live in the margins. In his address, Zinn suggested several strategies for counteracting these negative effects of archival neutrality. One strategy was conducting oral histories of marginalized people to fill in those gaps and silences in our collections. Another was prioritizing the documentation of social movements. A third strategy was to collect the necessary records for government accountability. And finally, he said, most importantly, we should campaign to open all government records to the public. You might notice that these strategies are still popular ways today to subvert the traditional whiteness of the archive. It is crucial for me to acknowledge, however, that these ideas were not new or flashy for people of color and other marginalized groups, who also have a long history of documenting and preserving their own culture since the traditional archives intentionally excluded them for many years. Truly, the first traditional archives in the United States were founded by white men for white men to keep white men in power. This set in motion the overall lack of trust that many marginalized groups have toward traditional archives even today. I include this well-known quote from journalist and activist Ida B. Wells because I believe it perfectly sums up the reason for the distrust of archives. We collect documents from those in power, we describe them as the default in our finding aids, and we continue to perpetuate their oppressive perspectives. So what happened in the traditional archival profession following Howard Zinn's speech in 1970? A few things. SCAA did form the following year an informal caucus that initiated the democratization of the organization. They set out to encourage recruitment and advancement of minorities within the profession, as well as improve the status of women within the profession. This caucus became the foundation for the Archivist for Change Committee, which later became Activist Archivists and then even later Progressive Archivists. There was some improvement that decade in the 1970s as women held more prominent positions in professional organizations, and archives employed documentation strategies and updated their collecting policies to include social movements. However, the 1980s rise of the right in US politics largely disrupted these trends in the archival field. The focus on increasing marginalized voices in the archives encountered steep challenges in the face of the conservative movement. But some archivists fought back in the 1990s. One of my personal favorite archival theorists, Terry Cook, along with Joan M. Schwartz, once again called out the supposed neutrality and objectivity of archives work. Cook and Schwartz said that archivists extolled their own myth of impartiality and stated, quote, "Archives are not passive storehouses of old stuff, but active sites where social power is negotiated, contested, and confirmed. The power of archives, records, and archivists should no longer remain naturalized or denied, but open to vital debate and transparent accountability," end quote. Despite the fact that SAA and the International Council on Archives undermined Cook and Schwartz's myth of impartiality, the proliferation of social justice theories and practices in archives continued into the 2000s and 2010s. Recently, the debate about using a social justice imperative in our profession involves some of the field's heaviest hitters, including Mark Green and Randall C. Jimerson. Green challenged the Arcable Activism tradition by restating the case for neutrality, while Jimerson believed activism in the field was a personal choice. Michelle Caswell, rather, makes the strongest statement. She believes that social justice is a human imperative, not just an archival one. Therefore, archives and records managers have an ethical responsibility to counteract the oppressive practices that have plagued the archival profession. This is where the present-day arguments currently exist. Now that we have a historical understanding of archival activism and the push for dismantling white supremacy and oppression in memory work, let's get into how we turn this theory into action. I start the second half of this presentation with a quote from one of my role models, Jarrett Drake, who actually unfortunately left the archives field due to its whiteness and unwillingness to change. Drake is specifically talking about the Black Lives Matter movement in this quote, but it can certainly be applied to other marginalized groups as well. He says in his essay, Expanding Archives for Black Lives, in order to document the Black Lives Matter movement responsibly, special collections, libraries, and archives must first do the following two things. First, they must confront their complicity in upholding patriarchy, white supremacy, and other structural inequalities. Second, they must build trust with the people, communities, and organizations around whose lives in the movement is centered. The trust they should pursue not under the guise of collection development, but under the practice of allyship. So what is allyship? And these two definitions here come from the Anti-Oppression Network. One, allyship is an active, consistent, and arduous practice of unlearning and reevaluating in which a person of privilege seeks to operate in solidarity with a marginalized group of people. Allyship is not an identity. It is a lifelong process of building relationships based on trust, consistency, and accountability with marginalized individuals and or groups of people. The key terms here are consistent and lifelong. The work of dismantling white supremacy in the archives is not linear. It is a constant state of learning and unlearning, of making mistakes and correcting them, of listening to the oppressed and not getting defensive, but instead changing course. If there is one single slide that you remember from today, I hope it is this one. I created this chart on how to liberate archives specifically for white archivists to put up in their offices or archival spaces. It is a reminder that this work is not easy or quick. It is arduous but necessary. So as you can see, as I was saying, this work isn't linear. It's a constant unlearning and learning. And normally you would start with confronting your white privilege and your white fragility and white supremacy first. Doing that self-reflection work is the first step, and it's the hardest step too. Really coming into terms with who you are and what your beliefs are and perspectives. If you're not used to, you know, thinking about yourself in that way, it can be really difficult at first. But like I said, it's the first step. And then after you can able to confront your own biases and perspectives, you can move on to educate. We all have different educations growing up. We've all learned from different people. We all study different things. Archives, you know, we all come from different backgrounds. So you might not necessarily know the specific histories of some of our marginalized people in the United States or wherever you're archiving. So it's good to read up and learn on those things. And there's plenty of resources out there that marginalized people have created. There's plenty of books and articles and websites and videos for all different marginalized groups. And then once you educate, you take your confrontation with your own self and then your education that you've been doing. And then you can start to bring the things that you've learned into your archive space with yourself as an archivist and your archives institution. And then you can start to break down where in the institution you might be proliferating white supremacy or patriarchal structures or other oppressive practices. And then you can start to chip away at that by disrupting. There are specific actions you can take, and we'll get into that later, to disrupt the status quo. And then as you can see, it just continues because it's not linear. You're going to make mistakes. That's probably the scariest part for a lot of people, especially white people. I think people just get so scared of offending or being wrong that they just don't take any action. And just know that you're gonna mess up. I mess up all the time. And the important part is how you learn from that and how you grow and change course. So let's get into some specifics. Let's put theory into practice. And we're gonna return to Jarrett Drake, who gives 2 ways you can evaluate and critique your archives institution today, which is with location of the archive and the language of the archive. And I'm going to talk about what we do here at the Albert Gore Research Center. So let's talk about the location of the Gore Center. It's on a university campus, and for all of you out there who might also be on a university campus, you know that it's fairly inaccessible for people that don't work or attend school at that place. Parking is usually always an issue no matter what. Those things can be intimidating for people. At the Gore Center, we are in the middle of campus and it's a weird place and you have to take a lot of crazy roundabouts to get here. And it's overall just very confusing, and that already flusters people before they even enter our space. We're only open Monday through Friday, 9 a.m. to 4 p.m., which doesn't work for a lot of people's schedules. Some of these things are based off things we used to do, by the way, and I will explain how we've tried to change or break down these issues. We used to ask people to provide government identification. We don't do that anymore. We ask people a lot in archives to depart with their personal belongings. We usually have staff that are, watching researchers. Generally, we're there to help, right? But we're also making sure that, in the back of our minds, a lot of us are making sure that things aren't getting destroyed or possibly stolen. And if you look at a lot of these things, they're very eerily similar to how marginalized people have interactions with the police state, right? So there's can be a lot of intimidating factors for marginalized people to come to an archive if it has that familiarity with the police. And that's not what we want at all, certainly at archives. And finally, the Gore Center, our name itself is a deterrent. This has been told to me by several members of the Murfreesboro Black community, that our name alone deters them from, partnering with us on projects or even coming into our space. Senator Albert Gore, while he did support many civil rights legislation during his time, he notoriously filibustered and voted against the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and that remains a very large stain on his record. We talk about this all the time in the archive. We blog about it, we post about it, we tell students about it. We know this is an issue. It's a hard history, but we don't hide it. But still, our name is there, right? If you don't know me or my colleague Donna personally, you might think that the people who work here are also representative of that name on our door. So it's hard to break away from that. Let's talk about language now. Our collections are very white and very male and very heterosexual. We do have quite a few, I would say about half of our collections are from women, but it's still mostly white women. So these are all very, very bad issues with our collections. Our finding aids usually describe white as the default. And yeah, our vocab and our descriptions really center white, straight, cisgender men. So what we have been doing at the Gore Center over time to start chipping away at some of this, not during the pandemic necessarily, in non-pandemic times, if a researcher asks us if we can come in on a Saturday, we normally do that. We've stayed late. I've stayed late for students, so we're trying to break that Monday through Friday, 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. issue. There's only so much we can do about campus parking, but we try our best to guide people. Like I said, we no longer require government identification in any way. We do have people fill out a form that has like their name and address and contact info, but that's, we let them know that that is just in case we need to get in contact them about their research. Yeah, I've already talked about how we try to break away from the name on our door. During the pandemic, we have been, the past year now, we've started to go into our finding aids and started to re-describe things so that the white is not the default, which is not something that you probably, you don't really think about it that much if you're a white person, because we're always the default for almost everything. But Samantha Wynn is an archivist in particular who talks about how to like re-describe things in our finding aids. So, so often we would say, oh, John Smith, a Black doctor in Murfreesboro. But if John Smith was white, we would just say John Smith, a doctor in Murfreesboro. You would never usually say a white doctor. So we're doing stuff like that. We're changing the language that we use. And what we've really started in the past 5 years is something called the Movement 68 Initiative. And this has its roots in that initial Black student activism that I talked about that started in 2015. So I was a student at the time, working in the Gore Center as a graduate assistant, and I started to document that movement because obviously it was incredibly important for university history, and it was an incredible moment to see these courageous young Black students standing up against the institution in which they attended. So we started to build this Forrest Hall protest collection. And so it documented the current movement, but then I also went back into our university archives and started to read against the grain and finding all of these instances in our school's history where Black students stood up against these Confederate symbols on our campus. And that actually dated back to 1960s. So this protest collection, which is a digital collection available for anyone to look at on our university library's website, it goes back to 1930, which traces the earliest instance I found of a Confederate imagery in our school's history. And it also traces back all those other instances of Black students protesting against racist symbols here. So I did this from 2015 to about 2016, 2017. I was building up this digital collection, has about 500 items in it, and we still add stuff because, spoiler alert, Forrest Hall is still here in the year 2020, which really makes this digital collection even more important because we're not letting that history, be hidden. We continue to talk about it constantly on our social media and in classrooms. But in 2018, that was going to be the 50th anniversary of when a Black student named Sylvester Brooks first called out all of this Confederate imagery on campus. And for that 50th anniversary, we decided we wanted to do some event to honor him in some way and to honor all of those Black student activists from the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, and today. That's how many waves of protests have been happening against things like Forrest Hall. So in the fall of 2017, I actually reached out to Sylvester Brooks through mail, the old snail mail. I found I found what I thought was his address online, and I just sent a letter and prayed and hoped that it was the right address and that he would get it and respond. And I put my phone number in there, my email, and sure enough, like 3 weeks went by and he called me and he said, "Hey, I got your letter. I'm really interested in this event that you want to do." And we ended up talking for about 45 minutes, and he was 100% down to do it. And the reason that just made me so relieved is because I was never going to do it without him. One of the big hurdles for getting this Movement 68 symposium going, and when we're doing this dismantling white supremacy in our archive, is building that trust. MTSU as a university, there's a great distrust between MTSU and the Black community here in Murfreesboro. And then, as I already mentioned, there's already distrust between the Gore Center and the Black community. So I knew in 2017, a full year ahead of when I wanted to do the symposium, that I had to start building trust then, because it was going to take probably a long time. But I still did not want to do it without Sylvester Brooks. It wouldn't have felt right if he didn't give his blessing, even if he didn't want to come to MTSU. But luckily he did. So I got the green light and I started working. And he was able to actually connect me with other people, other activists from the 60s and 70s that he knew. And it kind of came like a snowball effect. And having his trust was so important, because he would be able to go and tell people like, "Hey, Sarah's cool, like, she's doing the work. She's done her education. She knows what we've been through as Black students on this campus. She's not doing this just, for a thing on her resume. She really wants to change the culture at the Gore Center." So once he would tell people that, then people started to trust me and were able to talk to me. It didn't always go that way, though. If the one other thing you could take away from this is that building trust is also the hardest part, and it's going to take the longest, depending on which community you're trying to build trust with, what the relationship already might be with your archive in that community. Like I said, for me, it was hard because the Black community didn't trust us. And there was one person in particular that I really wanted on our panel, and it was the first Black student body president at MTSU, Dr. McDonald. And I was able to get in contact with him, and we spoke over the phone, and he said, "Look, I've had contact with the Gore Center before. I know the people that used to work there, and I did not have a good experience. So I don't trust you. So we need to get together and talk, and I need to see what you're about, Sarah." And I said, "That's fine. I totally understand. What do you want to do?" So we went and had lunch for about 2.5 hours, where he basically grilled me and like, did I show up to this meeting already educated? Did I just show up expecting him as a Black man to educate me, a white woman? And he determined after that 2.5 hour lunch that the Gore Center was trying to change. And he was fully supportive of being on the Movement 68 symposium panel and being part of it. And yeah, and then I was able to contact a few other activists, and we had a panel of 6 from the past 50 years. It was 2 hours, it went great. I think it was really the first time that MTSU, that these students, these Black students, that someone actually said, "Hey, I want to listen and hear your grievances and hear your experience here." It was the first time anyone ever really asked them to do that. So yeah, it was a really good 2 hour event. It's on our YouTube channel, on the Gore Center YouTube channel. It's closed captioned as well. And then out of the Movement 68 symposium, me and my colleague, Donna Baker, We decided it wasn't enough though. We can't just, you know, let the symposium end and then we're done. Because that's not how you build relationships over time. So the Gore Center started something called the Movement 68 Initiative. And there's a whole page on our website that goes into more detail on this. We also wrote a blog post for NCPH, National Council on Public History's blog, History at Work, that you can find. But essentially, out of all of our experience with building this digital collection and doing this symposium and building this relationship with these Black students and then breaking into the Black community of Murfreesboro, we decided to just make it core to the Gore Center's work moving forward that we were going to, you know, subvert what we have been doing in the past, the whiteness of our collections. You know, we know that needed to change. So Movement 68 initiative basically became a documentation strategy and part of our collections policy that, you know, we are going to target specific marginalized groups first on campus because that's our closest community, and then work outward. So since then, we've built a good relationship with the campus LGBTQ community. Their organization, MT Lambda, we have started to collect their records. And then out of that relationship, we built a relationship with a Nashville organization. And like I said, like kind of once you build a good, strong relationship with one group, it can really snowball. And then all of a sudden you have all these other connections, which is really great. This past summer, I've really started to work on building up our disability collections. So that's like the next group we're really targeting is disabled alumni and their experiences. And then also a part of all of this is how we teach our students. We're a university, we are part of the public history program in a way. The Gore Center takes on 4 public history students every year, and we train them in archival best practices. And so talking about all these issues I've talked to you today, and we do readings with them, and we put this theory into practice with them, we go over these issues, and it becomes core to their training as well. So we're not only trying to change the Gore Center, but we're trying to really change the archives field by putting capable, intelligent, anti-oppressive archivists out into the world. That's our goal at the Gore Center. And we can get into more about what we specifically do here at the Q&A, but this is my wrap-up slide. Just a reminder that, you know, we're trying to humanize the archive, and to do that, it's going to take continual, constant education on your part. You're going to make mistakes, and that's okay, as long as it matters how you respond to those mistakes. You're going to confront your complicity, and be just really in tune with who you are. What perspectives are you bringing to your work every day? What marginalized groups are you a part of? What oppressive groups might you be a part of? How do those interact, and how do they interact with how you think about archival work? Participatory archiving, that's really, you know, I'm sure you've heard that word before, because that's really the future of archiving. Is really we're working with communities now to help them archive their own stuff in their own space. And all of this goes into building that trust and long-term relationships, which can take a very long time. There's no easy route to it. And that's not always something that people want to hear because they want that easy fix, but doing it right the first time and really putting all of your effort into building that trust will make everything else fall in line a lot better, I promise. And that is basically all I had to say today. I wanted to leave time for questions, because it's always a really good discussion that comes out of this. And thank you for having me. And here's my contact info. And I'm going to stop sharing now and put my video back on. And thank you, Catherine, for putting all that stuff in the chat.
Thank you, Sarah. We are delighted to have you. This is a great capstone for the day, and we look forward to folks' questions. So folks, have at it.
I will put one poster in the chat that everyone can download that Michelle Caswell and her class came up with. And we actually have it hanging up here in the Gore Center. It's about, it breaks down specific archival, you know, practices when we do appraisal and education and stuff. And it describes certain actions archivists can take. So I'll just put that in the chat. You can just download it, print it out, and tape it up on a wall. Okay, what pushback have you received, do you still receive from alums and supporters of MTSU who still want to cling to Nathan Bedford Forrest? Yeah, the Gore Center doesn't usually get direct pushback, at least not in the past couple of years we haven't. And there is, I don't want to get like too ahead of myself because I'm going to knock on wood that these things actually happen, but there is some talks of us, the Gore Center, since Forrest Hall is still here, still on our campus, and doesn't seem to be going away. There's talks of the Gore Center helping create some panel displays that will be put in front of Forrest Hall to give it more context. And let's see, what else have we done? And there's currently a social justice initiative going on at MTSU across the wider university of trying to, you know, be more equitable in what MTSU does. And a part of that is doing some teaching about the history of our campus. So me and another history professor are planning some sort of webinar event for everyone at MTSU to attend to learn more about this, the racist history of MTSU and the Confederate imagery that we had. So those are like positive things that have come out in the past just year or two. But when we were, you know, building the Forrest Hall protest collection, we did like get attacked on social media by right-wing groups. They tried to like make the Gore Center look really bad, and it didn't overall really end up affecting us, thankfully. But it was, yeah, we know those people exist out there. We know, we get comments on like our social media, but luckily we have not received like a lot of direct pushback. And I recognize that as a privilege of the Gore Center because we fly under the radar pretty well here. If anyone who's familiar with MTSU could tell you that, and it works to our advantage in some ways in that we can kind of we push the buttons a lot here. We really do. Because no one higher up necessarily pays attention to us, for good or for worse. But we've really made an impact with the students though, and that's what matters to me. Every semester I have professors come ask me to teach their students about this history, and every semester it inspires some students to then go out and do some sort of activist movement action. So that's what I'm all about, and that's what I'm happy to see. Catherine says, how do you balance the need to be accommodating to researchers by staying late, etc., while maintaining your own work-life balance? Do you find it difficult to set boundaries on your resources and time when you want to provide as much help as possible? Yes. it is difficult for sure. And I think especially the Gore Center, we're such a small staff. There's a full-time archivist, there's only 2 of us, with a campus, you know, of 22,000 students, and then the larger community that uses our resources. So we're often feel like we're stretched pretty thin. But I think the boundaries that we set are usually for students, and students, whether they're MTSU or another college or university or even high school. We've had high school students use our stuff. That's where we set the boundary. We're kind of willing to go above and beyond for students. So we often stay late more for them or come in on weekends, but we make it work. Our boss is pretty good about, if we do stuff like that, about then taking some time off during the week or getting that time later whenever we choose. So that's really helpful, to have a supportive boss in that way. But yeah, no, I do find it difficult to set boundaries though, to answer that question, 100%. And that's why not everything I told you today might work for you necessarily. It might actually be really hard to do at your institution. I think government archives, you'll find if you work at a government institution, you're going to find probably the most challenges than at an academic archive. You're going to be hit with a lot of obstacles and people telling you no, or that you can't do this. So it's going to be a lot harder to chip away at oppression at government archives. But thank you for that question. I get that a lot. How do you balance everything you do? Not easily is the answer. Catherine Slover says, where do you find the balance between standing up against those systems and making sure there aren't repercussions from supervisors or those higher up, like in a government archive? Yeah, it's a difficult process. I would say you might be able to change things just within yourself as an archivist first. You might not be able to make like broad sweeping changes like we've done here at the Gore Center. But I think my best advice that I've gotten is to find your people, no matter what institution you're at. Find someone else who believes in this work too, believes in this anti-oppression work in archives, and start to build like coalitions within, and start to build coalitions maybe within with other institutions, and figuring out how to help each other. But I think first and foremost, especially in a situation like that, you can always start with yourself. And I think it's important as a white archivist, it's time for us to start calling out things that we see our fellow white archivists do, right, that might be oppressive. And yeah, just 100%, there might be repercussions. That's part of it, and that's the scary part of it, and that's something you have to get over. But yeah, there might be repercussions if you start doing this work in a more hostile, maybe more conservative institution. But I will say, as white people, as white archivists, usually we are better equipped because we have white privilege to navigate these spaces without repercussions, or our repercussions are not as severe as our Black and brown colleagues who bring these things up, right? It's usually safer and easier for us to talk about these things in the space with other white people. So I would just say, start getting comfortable with being uncomfortable with yourself, and then work outward from there. Jessica said, you talked about revising your finding aids to revise language and decenter whiteness. How do you choose which finding aids to review? Do you have strategies for what collections you prioritize? For us, it's, like I said, it's pretty easy to pick which ones because all of our collections are pretty white. Seriously, like 95%. So we've kind of just, we just kind of go down the line, honestly. We definitely have started with the ones that are used the most, though. You know, and we look at our reference stats for that. Which collections have gotten the most use in the past, 3 to 5 years, and let's start with those. And that goes for how we do any reprocessing or reevaluating of our finding aids. And as we're doing that, then we're decentering this whiteness. But moving forward, though, so that's us going back, right, and correcting past mistakes, and then, of course, moving forward with any photograph inventories or finding aids or any inventories, really, of any collection that our students do or that we do. That's like, now it's just part of our practice moving forward that you will always decenter the whiteness and describe everyone as they are and their identities as we know them. You don't necessarily know everyone's identities all the time, but when we do, just put it in there to begin with, and then we don't have to go back and do that correction later. Thank you for your comment, Shelby. James Cross, how do you decenter whiteness and description while at the same time providing access to researchers who are interested in marginalized groups? For example, how would you identify the Black physician so that a researcher who is interested in Black physicians would find the collection? Just rereading it, sorry. Yeah, we try to, I assume you're saying like the Black physician is not necessarily the creator of the record. So like the papers aren't just about him, but he exists somewhere in the collection, I think is what you're saying. And yeah, in that case, we try to call it out in the finding aid, in the description, in our container list, in the inventory, in that section. Obviously, when we have the Gore papers here, which are millions of pieces of paper. So it's not always possible to do that for every collection, right? We cannot go through, I can't go through every single document in Gore's papers and find marginalized groups. But for smaller collections, you could certainly, when you come across them, put that into the container list in the finding aid. But yeah, like I said, not everything works perfectly. You can do overarching things, but yeah, you're not always going to find every single, when you read against the grain in your collection, you're not always going to find every single marginalized person, because that's just not how archives work, right? We don't do item level stuff normally. Will the Library of Congress subject headings be a good way to do that? Yeah, we put Library of Congress subject headings into, we usually use those in our finding aid. Right before the container list, we have our subject headings, subject keywords. That could definitely be a way. What about a collection of the papers of the Black physician? Okay. So yeah, if the papers are of a Black physician, then usually the biographical note is where you would call out all the identities that you know. So don't know why I'm stuck on the name John Smith, but if John Smith is a Black physician, you would say John Smith was a Black physician, born X date in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. That's what I mean when you're decentering the whiteness, because normally that's already done. In our finding aids, the problem is we don't call out when someone's white, because that's the default. So like Albert Gore's finding aid does not say he was a white congressman, even though it should, because we just assume that, well, if I don't call it out, if they're Black, queer, disabled, whatever, then they just must be not those things. They're just the default of white, straight male. So yeah, we would call it out mostly in the biographical note is where you would find that, or the historical note, depending on what the papers are of, if that makes sense.
Do we have any additional questions?
You're welcome, Jessica. Thank you for your comment.
If there are no additional questions, then perhaps Tracy, we should turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you everyone for this first, and I don't know, maybe this won't be our only virtual meeting. Maybe we will be able in the future to somehow stream our meeting live so that more people can participate than can come in person. It's something to think about. Today turned out so well. I think that's something that the organization should consider going forward. But thank you, Sarah, for a wonderful capstone to a very great day. Thank you, Jim, for your leadership as president. And thank you, Krista, for the service you're going to do to the organization in this next year. We're excited about it. Thanks, everybody.
And I would just like to thank both Tracy and Tabitha again for their hard work on the setting up the sessions for the meeting. I'd like to thank the board for their help in making this all possible. I want to thank all of the presenters because without you, we don't have any sessions, but I want to thank all of them for their thought-provoking presentations. And I want to thank all of you for coming, because we do this for you, and we hope that you learned a lot and had a little fun while doing it. So again, thank you, and everybody have a good weekend.